A cold morning in January, in Manhattan. The city wakes, as it always does. Carriages roll past. Hotel doors open. No one knows that, inside a quiet room, a heart has just stopped. Within hours, a short telegram is sent. It carries no grief, no explanation, only a single order. Stop all construction. Hundreds of miles north, in the icy current of the St. Lawrence River, 300 men are at work on a small island. They are building a 6-story private castle. More than 120 rooms. Pink-gray granite cut from a neighboring island. Towers, arches, and grand halls already near completion. When the foreman finishes reading the telegram, everything stops at once. Chisels fall silent. Paintbrushes are set down. Saws rest motionless on their frames. There are no arguments, no questions. One by one, the workers line up and leave the island, abandoning a castle that is almost complete, and an emptiness that will last for more than 70 years. The man who ordered the construction to stop had more than enough money to finish it 10 times over. He was the force behind the most famous hotel in America. The man who hosted presidents, tycoons, and the most powerful figures of his age. And yet, he never returned to this island. This is not a video about an abandoned castle. It is the story of a project halted because of love. Why would a man rich enough to finish it without hesitation choose to stop forever? How did a Valentine's Day gift become one of the most famous unfinished monuments in American history? To understand the moment when 300 men laid down their tools at the same time, we have to go much further back. Back to a 13-year-old immigrant boy, to the heat of New York kitchens, and to a partnership that would redefine what America came to call luxury. If you want to know why a castle that was never completed became a living legacy for an entire region, stay with us. And if you value historical stories told with patience, honesty, and depth, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. The Immigrant Boy and the Power Learned in the Kitchen. In 1864, a ship carrying immigrants docked in New York after weeks crossing the Atlantic. Among the crowd was a 13-year-old boy, thin, German-speaking, with no money and no family waiting for him. His name was George Karl Boldt. Born in 1851 on the island of Rügen, off the Baltic coast, then part of Prussia. Back home, George had seen summer resorts and old castles owned by Europe's upper classes. In America, all he had was his labor and his time. New York in the 1,860 seconds was a city exploding with growth, but it was not forgiving. For young immigrants, there were usually only two realistic options, the docks or the kitchen. George entered the kitchen. His first job was as a busboy in a hotel near the harbor. No contract, no security. Work determined survival. He cleared tables, scrubbed floors, washed pots, hauled trash, and slept in a small basement room. The wages were barely enough to cover food and shelter. But that kitchen gave George something money could not buy: perspective. Through the swinging doors into the dining room, he saw another world. Men in dark suits discussed railroads, banks, real estate. Women dressed carefully, served according to strict and unspoken rituals. George was not allowed to speak, but he was allowed to watch. He noticed that the most powerful men in the room did not raise their voices. They barely spoke at all. And when they did, everyone listened. More importantly, they were not paying only for food. They were paying for a feeling. The feeling of being recognized, of being served before they had to ask, of being respected without demanding it. George began to read the room. Who sat where? Who disliked interruption? Who expected attention, but only in precise amounts? No one taught him this. Every shift became a lesson. By the early 1,870 seconds, George was no longer an anonymous busboy. His promotion to kitchen management was not accidental. It came after years of reliable work, minimal errors, and a rare ability to maintain order under pressure. He knew how to schedule staff, control supplies, and keep a kitchen functioning during peak hours. In a busy hotel, the kitchen is where failure usually begins. George was the reason it didn't. Responsibility increased. Wages did not. George understood that if he wanted more, he would have to look elsewhere. In the mid-1870s, he left New York and tried his luck in Texas. Historical records do not detail every job he held there, but contemporary accounts indicate he pursued opportunities in food service and hospitality in rapidly growing western towns. Texas was expanding fast, but it was unstable. Capital was scarce. Infrastructure was weak. Connections were everything. George did not fail for lack of skill. He failed because there was no system in place to reward that skill. After a short time, he returned to New York poorer than when he had left. No savings, no property, but with a crucial realization: ability only matters when placed in the right environment. Back in New York, George returned to kitchens and dining rooms. This time, he was no longer looking for work as unskilled labor. He positioned himself as someone who understood operations. He continued learning how to manage not just a kitchen, but an entire service system. It was during this period that an important door opened. In 1876, William Carr, the steward of the Philadelphia Club, was searching for a dining room manager. The Philadelphia Club was not a public restaurant. It was one of the most exclusive gentlemen's clubs in America. Bankers, lawyers, landowners. Mistakes here were not corrected with apologies. One error could end a career. William Carr needed someone with discipline, discretion, and an instinct for power dynamics. George was personally invited by William Carr. After Carr became aware of his reputation for consistency and control within professional service circles, George accepted and left New York for Philadelphia. At the Philadelphia Club, George entered a world where power did not announce itself. Here, he learned rules that were never written down. Service must anticipate need. Discretion is absolute. Beauty must never demand attention. George was not simply serving meals, he was maintaining social order. And it was here that a quiet but decisive personal turning point occurred. George met Louise Augusta Carr, William Carr's daughter. Louise had grown up surrounded by carefully designed spaces. She understood light, rhythm, and the emotional effect a room could have on people. Their marriage in 1877 did not bring wealth, but it created a rare partnership. George understood how people function. Louise understood how people felt. And from a basement kitchen in New York to the discreet dining rooms of Philadelphia's elite, one lesson had taken root in George Boldt. He didn't learn power from money. He learned it from service. But that lesson alone was not enough to place him at the center of American power. Something else was still missing, and the next decision he would make would change everything. Louise, the invisible but decisive partner. In 1877, in Philadelphia, George Boldt married Louise Augusta Carr. He was 26 years old, and she was only 17. Louise did not come from a wealthy family. Her father, William Carr, was the steward of the Philadelphia Club. It was not a position that created fortunes, but it granted something just as valuable: access. Louise grew up inside carefully controlled dining rooms, where light, spacing between tables, and the movement of servers mattered as much as the menu itself. That environment shaped her eye long before she ever designed a space of her own. In late 19th century America, public spaces belonged almost entirely to men. Restaurants, hotels, and clubs were designed around male habits and expectations. Women were present, but usually as companions, not as the center of the experience. Louise understood this reality, and she also understood something else. Upper-class women were changing. They wanted to go out. They wanted to meet. They wanted public spaces that were beautiful, safe, and dignified, not limited to the private parlors of their homes. At this point, George and Louise still owned nothing. They had no property of their own, only experience, observation, and a shared belief. That service was not only about efficiency, but about emotion. 4 years into their marriage, in 1881, their first real opportunity appeared. George Boldt purchased the Bellevue Hotel at the corner of Broad and Walnut Streets in Philadelphia. By the standards of the time, it was not a large hotel. It functioned more as an upscale restaurant than a full lodging destination. The investment was a genuine risk. George was not a millionaire. The capital came from years of savings, and failure would have meant losing everything. It was here that Louise's influence became unmistakable. She did not interfere with the kitchen. She did not manage staff. Instead, she reshaped the experience from the moment guests walked through the door. Louise insisted on fresh flowers on every table, every day. A costly decision, but one that immediately conveyed care and vitality. She widened the spacing between tables, a choice that went directly against the common practice of maximizing seating to increase revenue. The result was fewer tables, but higher spending per guest. The lighting was softened. Harsh overhead lamps were replaced with warmer, lower light that made conversation more comfortable and faces more flattering. These changes were never advertised. There were no signs proclaiming the Bellevue as the city's most elegant venue, but guests began to talk. Women noticed first. They recognized that this was one of the few places where they could linger, converse, and feel respected as participants, not accessories. The Bellevue quickly became a gathering place for Philadelphia's elite, not because it served the most elaborate food, but because it felt as though the space had been designed for its guests. Revenue rose steadily. Its reputation spread. There is a story, repeated in newspapers of the time, that the Boldts once shipped Philadelphia terrapin to Queen Victoria in England. There is no direct confirmation from royal records, but the story itself reflects how far the Bellevue's reputation had traveled. Whether fact or legend, one thing is certain: New York's elite began paying attention. George Boldt did not stop with the Bellevue. He acquired the Stratford Hotel across the street, effectively controlling both corners of a major intersection. From a business standpoint, it was a strategic move. Direct competition was eliminated. Market position was secured, but it was Louise's emotional architecture that kept guests coming back. At a time when hotels were often cold, imposing displays of status, the Bellevue felt private without being exclusive. It was a public space that did not make people feel small. And here, a quiet social tension emerged. Old money elites were accustomed to controlling space. They expected environments to revolve entirely around them. The Bellevue still served them, but it also welcomed women, social gatherings, and a new form of public presence in urban life. Not everyone approved of this shift, but they kept coming because the space itself resolved the argument. By the late 1882s, the Bellevue was no longer just a successful establishment. It had become a new standard for experience. George ensured flawless operation behind the scenes. Louise shaped emotion out front. And just as the couple seemed firmly established in Philadelphia, a much larger door unexpectedly opened in New York. But that alone still does not explain the deeper mystery behind their rise. Because what Louise was doing at the Bellevue was not simply arranging tables and flowers. She didn't decorate rooms. She redesigned dignity. And that philosophy would soon carry the name Boldt, far beyond Philadelphia, straight into the center of American power. Waldorf Astoria, the peak of social power. By the late 1882s, Philadelphia had become too small for George Boldt's ambitions. The Bellevue was successful. The Stratford was under control. His reputation no longer belonged to a single city. But New York was the true center of power. At that time, Fifth Avenue was still primarily a residential enclave for old money families. Those who owned land there were not merely wealthy. They represented the social order of America itself. No family embodied that order more clearly than the Astors. William Waldorf Astor, born in 1848, was the direct heir to one of the largest fortunes in the United States. By the end of the 19th century, the Astor family's wealth was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, the equivalent of tens of billions today. But power within the Astor family was fractured. A long-running personal conflict between William Waldorf Astor and his cousin, John Jacob Astor IV, quietly divided the dynasty. The two men owned adjacent parcels of land on Fifth Avenue, and both intended to build something large enough to assert dominance. It became an unspoken confrontation, but everyone in New York society understood it. In 1891, William Waldorf Astor decided to build a hotel unlike anything America had seen. Not simply a place to stay, but a symbol. He needed someone capable of managing not just a building, but an entire social ecosystem, and the name that surfaced was George Boldt. The invitation Boldt received was not without risk. Fifth Avenue had never been hotel territory. The city's elite resisted the idea of outsiders passing their front doors. The project faced social opposition, financial risk, and the possibility of very public failure. George Boldt understood all of this, but he also knew that doors like this did not open twice. He accepted. To prepare the Waldorf, Boldt needed to raise approximately $100,000 for furnishings alone, a sum equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. It was a personal financial gamble, with no guarantee of return. On March 13, 1893, the Waldorf Hotel officially opened. The timing could not have been worse. The United States was entering a severe economic collapse known as the Panic of 1893. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment surged. Opening a luxury hotel in the middle of a national depression was a dangerous bet, but the Waldorf was not designed for the masses. It targeted the class untouched by economic panic. The hotel was quiet, restrained, free of spectacle. It offered what power required in uncertain times: stability and discretion. And it succeeded. But the story did not end there. In 1897, John Jacob Astor IV opened the Astoria Hotel directly next door. The architect was the same, Henry J. Hardenberg. The ambition was identical: to become New York's social center. Two massive structures stood side by side, a family feud rendered in stone and steel. Society watched closely. Who would prevail? Who would control the city's new axis of power? At the height of this tension, George Boldt made a decision that changed everything. Instead of choosing sides, he chose resolution. Boldt persuaded both branches of the Astor family to unify operations. A corridor was constructed to connect the two buildings. Waldorf and Astoria became a single entity. The Waldorf Astoria was born. With more than 1,600 rooms, it became the largest hotel in the world, not only in scale, but in influence. Presidents, industrialists, diplomats, and major decisions were made in its dining rooms and grand halls. George Boldt was no longer managing a hotel. He was managing a convergence of power. Louise continued to shape the environment, even without formal recognition. Fresh flowers, daily. Soft lighting that flattered faces. Women entering through the main doors, not side entrances. These changes were subtle, but they quietly redefined social norms. The Waldorf Astoria was not merely a place to stay, it became an address. Here, iconic dishes bearing the Waldorf name were created. Room service was standardized. The rituals of modern hospitality took form. The New York Times later wrote that no individual had done more to shape the modern American hotel than George Boldt. By the late 1892s, Boldt was among the highest-paid figures in the country. Beyond salary, he held lucrative leases and interests. Contemporary press estimates placed his fortune between $15 and $25 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions or more than $1 billion today, depending on calculation. He had reached the summit. But at the peak, a new question emerged. If social power had already been secured, what was still missing? The answer was not on Fifth Avenue. It was privacy. And the next decision George Boldt would make would carry the story away from the heart of New York and into an entirely different chapter. If he didn't just manage power, he unified it. And in data, subscribe into 7, but that unity would come at a very high cost. Hard Island withdrawal from the stage. By the late 1892s, as the Waldorf Astoria had become the center of American social power, George Boldt began searching for something entirely different. He lacked nothing: not money, not influence, not invitations into public life, but life at the heart of New York came with a clear cost. Every dinner was a social obligation. Every holiday became a public event. There was no true silence. George Boldt had grown up in Europe, where castles and summer estates existed apart from politics and commerce. Louise, after more than 20 years shaping spaces for others, began to want a place that did not need to please anyone. Together, they looked north. Around 1895, the Boldt family traveled to the Thousand Islands region along the St. Lawrence River, the natural border between the United States and Canada. The area consists of more than 1,800 islands, scattered across a wide, deep, fast-moving river. The Thousand Islands were nothing like Newport. There was no formal social season, no unspoken calendar for displaying status. Wealthy families came here not to be seen, but to disappear from view. They sailed, they fished, they read, and they slowed down. George Boldt stayed in a grand hotel in the region. But to him, a hotel, no matter how perfect, still meant a front desk, staff, and schedules. He wanted a place without timetables, without guest lists, without social rituals. The couple began searching for a private island. Many were already owned. Some lay too far offshore. Others were too large to manage. Then they heard of Hart Island, a roughly 5-acre island near Alexandria Bay. At the time, it held a small cottage built by former Congressman Elijah Kirk Hart. The island had just changed hands, but within days Louise Boldt personally purchased it. The recorded price reflected a legal formality more than the true value of the land. Immediately after the transaction was complete, George Boldt changed the spelling of the island's name from Hart Island to Hart Island. And he did not stop there. The shoreline was reshaped. Earth and stone were added. Viewed from above, the island now formed the shape of a perfect heart, and this was not a practical decision. It offered no economic advantage. It served no public display of power. It was a symbolic act. Hart Island was not created to impress guests. It was created to say one thing. In the years that followed, the Boldt family used the existing cottage as a summer retreat. They did not rush to build. They watched the island through changing seasons. At the same time, George Boldt acquired additional land on nearby Wellesley Island. There, he developed a farm, a golf course, polo fields, stables, tennis courts, and cottages for close friends. Entertaining continued. But Hart Island held a different role. It was smaller, closer, and more private. As their children grew, the island took on a new meaning. George Boldt Jr., the eldest son of George and Louise, was born in 1878. Anne Clover Boldt, their youngest child, was born in 1884. By the late 1892s, both children were old enough to spend entire summers in the Thousand Islands. These were no longer brief hotel stays, but full seasons lived on the river. Hart Island became a true family space. George Jr. learned to swim and row, and followed his father as he observed how nearby agricultural lands were managed. Clover grew up among lawns, gardens, and winding paths along the shoreline. Here, there were no reporters, no guest lists, no gaze from New York society. For George Boldt, the island was a place where he could be a father, not a hotel executive. For Louise, it was the first space in years where she lived without being evaluated. The family's growing presence on the island began to change how they viewed its future. The small original cottage grew cramped, but the issue was not square footage alone. They were not looking for more rooms. They were looking for a place that could hold the family together, a structure strong enough to endure harsh winters, and private enough not to become an extension of the hotel world. Around 1899, George Boldt made a decision that reflected both power and emotion. He would build a castle, not a large mansion called a castle, but a structure directly inspired by the towers and fortifications of the Rhineland, the landscapes he remembered from childhood in Europe. George Boldt hired the Philadelphia architectural firm G.W. and W.D. Hewitt, the same firm responsible for the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. The instructions were explicit. This was not a public building, not a symbol of authority, and not meant for outsiders. Louise participated directly in reviewing the plans. She focused on circulation, lighting, room proportions, and the boundary between family life and guest spaces. The goal was not grandeur, it was belonging. The final design called for a six-story structure with multiple towers and approximately 120 rooms. The total interior space measured around 44,000 square feet. Pink granite was quarried from nearby Oak Island, which George Boldt also acquired for the project. The estimated budget reached $2.5 million at the time, equivalent to more than $80 million today. George Boldt selected the intended completion date with care, Valentine's Day. The castle was never planned to open to the public. There would be no inauguration, no honored guests. It was a gift. And here, as the project grew beyond the scale of an ordinary retreat, a new tension quietly emerged. George Boldt had withdrawn from the public stage of power, yet he was now building something larger than ever before, and entirely private. That still does not fully explain the mystery behind this decision, because the castle on Hart Island was not created to welcome visitors. This wasn't a palace for guests. It was a promise, and that promise was about to enter its most expensive, ambitious, and fragile chapter: the construction, ambition, and detail. By the end of 1899, the decision had been made. The question was no longer whether to build, but how large it would become. Hart Island was isolated. There were no roads, no local supply depots. Every stone, steel, beam, and timber had to arrive by boat. George Boldt understood this clearly. He had managed hotels with thousands of rooms, but building on an island in the middle of the St. Lawrence River was an entirely different challenge, and he chose to think big from the start: scale. The final design for the main castle called for 6 stories, multiple towers, and approximately 120 rooms. The total interior space measured close to 44,000 square feet. The foundation alone had to be dug deep enough to withstand winter ice pressure and the powerful currents surrounding the island. A steel frame was integrated into the structure, a modern choice at the turn of the 20th century, allowing the building to be taller, heavier, and more durable than stone alone. The primary material was pink gray granite, quarried from nearby Oak Island. George Boldt did not simply purchase the stone. He acquired quarry rights to control color consistency, block size, and delivery schedules. The initial budget was set at $2.5 million at the time. That figure equals more than $80 million today, not including auxiliary buildings. But the castle was only the center of a much larger system. Auxiliary structures. George Boldt was not building a house. He was building a complete estate. Across the channel on Wellesley Island, a massive yacht house was constructed. The structure rose more than 15 meters high and stretched nearly 50 meters in length, large enough to house several sizable vessels. Most prominent among them was a houseboat more than 30 meters long, named La Duchesse, intended for travel throughout the islands. Dozens of smaller boats supported transportation, leisure, and supply operations. On Hart Island itself, a powerhouse was erected, disguised as a medieval tower. From the outside, it featured stone walls, arched openings, and a round tower form. Inside, steam-driven generators produced electricity for the entire castle, gardens, and walkways. This was a bold choice. In 1900, electricity was not yet standard in private residences, especially in remote regions. Another structure, the Ulster Tower, was designed to resemble an old German defensive tower, but its interior told a different story. The lower level housed a bowling alley. Above it were a billiard room, a library, bedrooms, and a kitchen. The top floor, known as the shell room, was a circular space intended for dancing and gatherings. Ulster Tower was not built for display. It was meant to separate entertainment from family life within the main castle. Even the arrival experience was symbolic. A dramatic water gate with a stone arch and drawbridge required visitors arriving by boat to pass through a gatehouse before stepping onto the island. Modern technology. Beneath its medieval appearance lay an advanced technological system. The castle was designed with central heating, Pipes were hidden within thick stone walls to maintain stable temperatures during harsh winters. Hot and cold running water reached every room. Electric lighting illuminated corridors, libraries, bedrooms, and even outdoor paths. Below ground, a network of service tunnels allowed staff to move between buildings without crossing formal living spaces. These features were not meant to impress. They existed to ensure smooth, silent operation. George Boldt had begun his career in kitchens. He understood that the true beauty of a building often lies in what no one sees. Hidden hearts. As the structure took shape during 1901 and 1902, another layer of detail began to appear. Small heart motifs were carved into stone, railings, floor tiles, and stair handrails. They were not large. They were not decorative centerpieces. They appeared only where careful observers would notice. A stone tucked beside a window, a metal detail along a railing, a subtle pattern in tiled flooring. No official records explain these symbols, but surviving drawings and fragments show they were placed deliberately. They were not family crests. They were not symbols of power. They were reminders. This castle was not built to endure as a political monument. It was built for one person. Escalation. By the end of 1903, the project was more than 90% complete. The exterior was finished. Windows and doors were installed. Many rooms were plastered, floored, and even furnished. The powerhouse was operational. The yacht house was ready. Ulster Tower had already hosted its first gatherings. The Italian-style gardens began to take shape, arranged in geometric patterns with pools, statues, and paths leading toward the river. The plan was clear. Complete construction in 1904. Present the gift on Valentine's Day, 1905. But here, just as everything appeared under control, another force began to interfere with the schedule. Not money, not engineering, not weather. Health. And that is where the story prepares to turn in a direction no one had anticipated. Every stone had meaning, but not every promise is allowed to be fulfilled. Illness time running out, around 1901, as construction on Hart Island moved beyond foundations and primary structure, a new variable entered the story. It was not in the blueprints, not in the budget, and not something organization or discipline could control. Louise Boldt began to experience persistent fatigue. At first, the signs were difficult to define. Shortness of breath, exhaustion that did not fade with rest, an irregular heartbeat during walks that had once been effortless. At the turn of the 20th century, medical diagnostics were limited. Later records and family accounts suggest two possibilities: tuberculosis or chronic heart disease. There is no definitive conclusion, only one certainty. Louise's health was declining. By this time, Louise was in her early 40s. She was not a fragile woman. For years, she had worked continuously between Philadelphia and New York, actively involved in design, organization, and operational decisions at some of the most important hotels in America, but her body began to fail her. Doctors advised rest, limited travel, avoiding strain. In that context, Hart Island was seen as a place of potential recovery. Clean air, a slower rhythm, minimal social demands. Yet even as her strength faded, Louise did not withdraw from the project. She adapted the way she participated. Temporary ramps were built so she would not need to climb steep stairs. Chairs were placed near windows on partially finished floors, so she could observe light and views without moving far. Instead of walking the site, she remained seated. Samples were brought to her. Fabrics, tiles, door handles, detailed drawings of wall lamps and chandeliers. Louise reviewed each item carefully. There were no longer rapid discussions, no constant revisions, but the precision remained. She selected colors so that morning light would not feel harsh. She required windows large enough to capture river air, without creating winter drafts. She paid attention to the separation between quiet bedrooms and active living spaces, and to corridors wide enough for tired bodies to move without strain. These decisions did not create spectacle, but they determined how the house would feel to live in. Meanwhile, Construction continued to accelerate. Then 1903, stone continued to arrive on the island. The steel frame was completed. Electrical and heating systems entered testing phases. The castle moved steadily toward completion. Louise did not. Her visits to the island grew shorter. Recovery time, after each trip, lengthened. George Boldt saw this clearly. He did not slow construction. He pushed it forward, not out of ambition, but because time was beginning to take on a very specific shape. The plan remained unchanged. Completion in 1904. Presentation on Valentine's Day, 1905. But between plan and reality, a silent countdown had begun. By late 1903, Louise rarely traveled to Hart Island. She spent most of her time in Manhattan, close to doctors and hospitals. Design decisions were sent by letter, by notes, by brief instructions rather than conversations. Construction continued. Walls rose. Doors were installed. But the distance between the castle and the woman it was built for grew wider each day. And here, just as everything appeared nearly ready, the story prepared to cross a line from which there would be no return. Because time does not always wait for construction to finish. The castle kept rising. Her strength did not. And what followed did not merely stop a project. It stopped a life, death, and the order to stop. On the morning of January 4, 1904, Manhattan woke to a cold, gray winter day. Inside a quiet room, Louise Augusta Boldt died at the age of 42. For months, illness had steadily weakened her heart. That morning, it finally stopped. There was no accident. No dramatic final moment. Only time running out. George Boldt was at her side. Their two children, George Boldt Jr., 24, and Anne Clover Boldt, 20, were also present. The death certificate listed heart failure as the cause. Whether this was the result of prolonged lung disease or a chronic heart condition cannot be determined with certainty from the medical records of the time, but the outcome did not change. Louise was gone. Within hours of her death, a telegram was sent from New York. It was brief. It offered no explanation. It carried no words of mourning, only an order. Stop all construction. The telegram traveled north along the Hudson River, then up the St. Lawrence River to a small island in the Thousand Islands region. Hart Island. At that moment, approximately 300 workers were on the island. Stonecutters, masons, carpenters, painters, metal workers. They had been laboring there for years. They had raised towers of stone, carved arches, and laid halls of pink-gray granite quarried nearby. The castle was nearly complete. Roughly 90% of the work was finished. The exterior was complete. Windows and doors were installed. Many rooms had been plastered, floored, and even furnished. The yacht house was ready. Ulster Tower had already hosted gatherings. The powerhouse could generate electricity. The gardens were planted, waiting for spring. When the foreman read the telegram, no explanation was required. Chisels froze mid-air. Paintbrushes were set down. Saws were placed back on their racks. There was no shouting, no argument. The worksite fell silent. One by one, the workers lined up and left the island. No one was asked to stay. No alternative tasks were assigned. The order was absolute. George Boldt did not return to Hart Island. Not that day. Not in the months that followed. Some newspapers later suggested he may have visited the island once more, but no verifiable evidence supports that claim. The consistent account from family members and those who knew him is that George Boldt never set foot in the castle again. The project had been built for Louise, not for society, not for history, not even for the family. When Louise died, the purpose of the castle ended with her. There was no order to demolish it, no plan to complete it, only suspension. The castle remained, like a heartbeat stopped mid-pulse. What followed was not action, but absence. George Boldt returned to New York. The Waldorf Astoria still required his leadership. The Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia, costing approximately $8 million at the time, was nearing its opening. Professional life continued, but Hart Island did not. There was no hammering, no stone against stone, no lights burning through the night, only river wind and a structure that never reached the end of its promise. Some projects end with applause. This one ended with silence. Some projects end with applause. This one ended with silence. And that silence did not merely freeze a construction site. It opened a much longer chapter, a chapter of abandonment, of time, and of a question no one could answer at that moment. What happens to a dream when the person it was built for is gone? Abandonment, destruction, and oblivion. After January 4, 1904, Hart Island no longer had an owner in any meaningful sense. George Boldt did not return. The castle was never completed. No formal decision was made about its future. For years, the site existed in suspension, a castle nearly finished, but uninhabited, unmaintained, without purpose. Time began to do its work. Noble. In 1918, 2 years after George Boldt's death, Hart Island was sold. The new owner was Edward John Noble, a businessman from Gouverneur, New York, best known for owning Beechnut and for helping turn Lifesavers candy into a nationwide success. Noble was no stranger to large ventures. He saw economic potential in the castle. The story of George and Louise Boldt's interrupted love had already spread through newspapers. Tour boats regularly passed the island, slowing as visitors stared at the unfinished towers. Noble imagined multiple possibilities: a hotel, a resort, or a paid attraction. But he never committed to finishing or properly securing the structure. Instead, public access was loosely permitted. There was little supervision, no consistent protection. The decision appeared generous. In reality, it was dangerous. Vandalism. Over time, Hart Island became an unofficial destination. Pukin teenagers. Teenagers, scavengers searching for metal. Windows were smashed. Walls were defaced with graffiti. Copper pipes and electrical wiring were stripped and sold. Materials that had been chosen with care were removed piece by piece for scrap value. Not all destruction came from malice, but the result was the same. The building deteriorated rapidly. In 1939, fireworks ignited a fire inside the powerhouse. The roof collapsed. The interior was destroyed. Only the blackened stone shell remained. The fire did not erase the building, but it marked a point of no return. War. Then came a larger force. During World War II, metal became a strategic resource. In 1942, iron and steel components were removed from the castle to support the war effort, not as vandalism, but as sanctioned salvage. For a structure already weakened by neglect, the loss of metal support further compromised its stability. What remained was left to face time and weather alone. Nature. Without human care, nature reclaimed the island. In winter, ice pressed against the stone foundations. In spring, water seeped into fractures. In summer, trees and vines grew where rooms once stood. Luisa's Italian gardens disappeared beneath weeds. The swan pond stagnated. Vines crept through empty windows. By the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, Hart Island had become a romantic ruin. From a distance, the castle looked like something from a fairy tale. Up close, engineers called it unsafe. Photographs from this era show trees growing inside rooms, rain falling through collapsed roofs, and light pouring through window frames stripped of glass. Escalation. In 1958, Edward John Noble died. Ownership of Hart Island passed to the E.J. Noble Foundation. The foundation had no concrete plan to save the castle. Restoration estimates reached tens of millions of dollars, a difficult figure to justify for a property generating no income. Meanwhile, the damage accelerated. The greatest threat was no longer vandalism. It was total collapse. Walls cracked, roofs failed, Entire sections became too dangerous to enter. And here, when the story seemed to be ending, it began to turn. Because some places are not saved by money, but by collective will. That story comes next. Love abandoned becomes a ruin. Not all at once, not with a single collapse, but over decades of neglect. When a community saves a legacy, by the late 1960s, Hart Island faced an unavoidable truth. The castle was no longer just abandoned. It had become a liability. Engineers warned of partial collapse. Insurance companies refused coverage. Local authorities began discussing the possibility of permanent closure. Without intervention, the castle would not be saved. It would be sealed off, then left to fall apart on its own. But this is where the story turns. The $1 deal. In 1977, ownership of Hart Island was transferred to the Thousand Islands Bridge Authority. The price, $1 dollar. Not because the castle lacked value, but because its value could no longer be measured in money. The agreement came with clear conditions. The structure would be preserved, never demolished, and reopened to the public. This was not a real estate transaction. It was a moral decision. From that moment on, the castle no longer belonged to one family. It belonged to collective memory. Tickets that sustained restoration. Once control was assumed, the challenge was immediate. Restoration costs were estimated at tens of millions of dollars. Public funding was insufficient. Private donors were inconsistent. The solution was neither a single grant nor a wealthy patron. It was a slow, transparent, and sustainable model. Open the castle to visitors, sell tickets, and use every dollar collected to save the building itself. In the early years, revenue was modest, just enough to stabilize the most dangerous sections, prevent collapse, stop water infiltration, reinforce weakened stone. There were no grand reconstructions, no dramatic completions, only one objective: to keep the castle from dying again. Gradually, sections were secured, walls were reinforced, roofs were temporarily sealed. Surviving details were protected from weather and vandalism. The local community stepped in. Volunteers, historians, preservation engineers. The castle began to return to life, not as a palace, but as a shared responsibility. The philosophy of leaving it unfinished. A difficult question soon emerged. Should the castle be completed according to George Boldt's original plans? The answer was no. The decision was made early and deliberately. Hart Island would never be fully finished. Not for lack of money, but for lack of moral justification. To complete the castle would be to rewrite the story, to turn a monument of love into a purely commercial attraction. To preserve its unfinished state was to preserve the moment when time itself had stopped. Rooms without floors remain exposed. Walls without plaster still reveal raw stone. Not as failure, affirmative problem, but as testimony. In quote, the castle does not tell only a story of love. It tells a story of loss, of human limits, and of the decision to stop. The dream didn't die. It changed hands, from one man to a community, from a private promise to a shared legacy. And in that transfer, Hart Island finally found a way to exist, without betraying the reason it was ever built. Not every love story needs a perfect ending, and not every structure built with money needs to be completed to be considered a success. Hart Island exists as an exception. A castle left unfinished, yet never a failure. A project incomplete, yet more honest than many finished monuments of power. George Boldt had the money to finish it. He had the influence to turn it into a hotel or into another social symbol of his era. But he stopped. Not because he lacked the ability, but because the reason was gone. In an age that celebrated expansion, display, and buildings that had to be bigger, higher, and more impressive, the decision to stop became a quiet statement that some things should not continue, simply because we are able to. This castle does not represent power, it represents limits. The limits of human beings before time, the limits of wealth before loss, and the limits of ambition when faced with truth. Today, Heart Island tells more than a love story. It tells the story of an era when even the richest people in America still knew when to stop. Once meaning was no longer there. Some castles are built to last forever. This one was built to tell the truth. And perhaps that is why it still matters. Not because of its beauty, but because of its silence. If you were George Boldt, would you finish this castle or leave it unfinished as a vow? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to continue exploring stories where power, wealth, and legacy collide with the real human beings behind them, the videos on screen will take you even deeper. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.